Don't. I'd love to do that. That would be. Ah, Mark, how are you?
Very good, Mike. How you doing? How
I'm
you
not too
doing?
bad, thank you.
All
Not too
good.
bad at all. Excited to speak to you.
Likewise. Well, very
Hey,
few people say that, so I'm humbled in that case. So you're very kind.
I'm. I'm sure you can give us some good facts and evidence and things that you've looked at over the years and how
Well,
things
I'll
have changed
do
from
my
a
best.
3D
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah, of course, and I'll help in any way I can. So thanks for inviting me on, Mike. It's a pleasure. So thank you.
No, I'm sure I remember, and I mean we're going back years now when somebody's just wrote "bully meets bow."
Well, he needs what? Sorry. Can I see the
Somebody's
question?
wrote "bully meets the bow."
Who's that? All
some,
right, I see. I
some
see.
guy, some guy last week called Chuck Cook said I look like Boris Johnson.
Well, I'll let you respond to that, Mike. So there's
John
even questions I
responded.
can answer.
Well, it was. I'll tell you what, it was a riot. But
I
I'm
can
getting
imagine.
back now. Years ago, a good friend of mine was Keith Williams. The
Yeah, yeah,
time he was
yeah,
national coach,
yeah.
and I'm sure he showed me some of your original stuff. I mean, that's probably going back 20
20
years.
years ago. I mean, I met Keith originally. I guess he would have just about left England. So that would have probably been 2004, maybe 2005, that kind of generation before Peter Madison took over. So that would probably been
Yeah,
at
I
least
mean, that's
ago.
going back, and he
Uh,
also,
but, yeah, but I know kind of. I say know Keith well. I know Keith well enough. I don't know Keith
yeah, yeah,
abundantly
yeah.
well, but always been very kind and cool guy, and yeah, always very pleasant to spend time with. So yeah, good guy.
That's where I very first saw the name Mark Bull and
Okay.
that side that the start of the sort of 3D journey, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, this is my, trying to think now, 2001, so 20 years almost for me now since I first kind of, do what I'm very lucky to do today, really. So yeah, it's kind of 20 lucky. So
And
I was,
how's it changed then, Mark, over the years? From I
as
mean,
in what the kind
what are we
of,
measuring then to what we're looking at now?
I think it's like kind
Because
of most technologies. I mean, they evolve. Anytime a new device is developed, Mike, the following day something new comes along. So I think most kind of systems or hardware or software systems or any kind of devices, they're probably valid for about a day. And then there's a version X, like probably computers, you buy it, and then the following day, or phones, there's a new version available. So when you kind of look back, when I was first involved 20 years back, now it was quite invasive, quite slow, um, fairly kind of primitive in a good way as far as what it measured and captured, how it captured it, how it measured it, how it kind of displayed it. Um, but like every good kind of evolution, you've got to start somewhere, really. So you kind of look at it, it's all relative to kind of what you know at the time and what you have at the time. So certainly 20 years back, even having one plot was hugely, um, revealing and significant and expansive then. And then you get a few more plots and you look at more segments and you get more of a case study history, you get more know-how behind it, get some good credible research behind it. So that's kind of how it's expanding next. So it'd be really interesting, all being well, we'll do this call in 20 years' time again, hopefully in better circumstances. Forward.
yeah.
I remember back in 2020 when it was we did that stuff, and but that's kind of how I've always tried to see things. You're always very respectful of history because history leaves clues in life that if we look closely enough, we can learn so much through history. But also that kind of that what next and kind of what now and where do we go with this stuff. So I've always had that very expansive approach to movement, to learning, to evolution, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, where it goes next, I'm actually looking at some hardware myself. I'm currently developing my own hardware system, which we were hopeful will be ready this summer. That's going to be delayed now, obviously, because of where the world's at with the unfortunate circumstances we're in. So I'm certainly hopeful by the end of the year, my new hardware will be ready. And that's very cool. So that's kind of more recognition based. So we'll just see you and I as you and I. You won't need to wear any markers or sensors, as they're probably more informally known. And so yeah, so it's certainly, but motion capture is a philosophy. It's been quite, it's a very complex, hugely yeah, very complex process procedure of motion capture. So that's why it's probably been fairly late in terms of its development, because to actually get credible, reliable information just takes time. And it's, you kind of look at it with, say, 3D systems that typically might, the first question I ask is, don't ask what they measure, ask what they don't measure. So what doesn't the system do rather than what it does do? You know, and we're all, you know, we all do, we're all part of that kind of issue that we're very good at saying what we do and what we do have, but we don't then often reveal what it doesn't do and what we don't have. So I'm kind of always looking at those approaches as well. So hopefully the next 10, 15, 20 years it'll be equally as fun and equally as, again, as innovative, and let's see where it goes, really.
And when you look at what we're measuring now,
Yeah.
what are the main ingredients that you're looking for when you're measuring people now biomechanically?
Oh, that's a really expansive question in a good way. I mean, it all starts with, can you define what good data is? So the answer is, well, good for who? So good data for player A can be very unhelpful data for player B. So even defining good data can be very challenging, that for every guy that wins a major championship this way, there'll be two that win it that way. So that's what makes it a wonderfully kind of divisive area, but all in a very kind of embracing, fun way that, you know, it's like research. For every paper it shows one thing, there's two papers that show something different, and they both argue they're right, which is why the research world is quite a slow process to move through. So really what I look for in many ways is, historically, when they play their best, they do what? When they're pain-free, they do what? When they're very adaptable movement, they move what way? When they're very powerful, very elastic, they kind of move in which way? So when I've got a history of a player, some guys I've been blessed to know for 20 years now, Mike. So you kind of got that case study history that, you know, when they move in certain ways, they're more adaptable, they're more autonomous, they're more powerful. They're more explosive, they're pain-free. So we know that for them is good information. And equally so, when they start to get irritated, they start to get really disruptive ball flights, they get dominant moves, they kind of produce these values. So that's kind of what I look at in most players still, because it's very, very hard to define, define what good data is. Good for who?
Well, I think where I was going was, I'm sure I listened to something you were doing the other week, and you were on about the fact that the pelvis movement was very similar in a lot of players that you'd measured.
Yeah.
And what was in my mind was, okay, so if the pelvis movement is very similar in a lot of players, does that mean the spine movement's similar in a lot of players, but actually other things are what are more variable?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to take that approach. I can certainly see why. But when you look at real kind of spine anatomy, I mean, every spine is different. So it's a bit like, we have these orthopedic ranges in the spine, but everyone's, look at the various columns, the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, the cervical spine. Although we have the same vertebrae, they're all different depths, different orientations. So we all have different amounts of range available through each kind of pairs of vertebrae. Everyone's pelvis is a slightly different width and different depth. Most people's hip configuration is a different socket depth, the femoral head, the top of the big long bone in the leg is slightly orientated different. So we all have uniquely different ranges, different perceptions of movement based on those joint configurations. So that's the kind of real precise approach when you look at movement. The pelvis is still possibly the one segment where you see less variability, which I think is kind of what I said whenever it was.
Yeah.
So you often, if you look at all the segments, hand, head, rib cage, pelvis, all the joints, wrist, shoulder, hip, for example, the pelvis is often where you'll see less variability and more of a thread that will run through typically the very advanced players on the planet. And there's also equally where you see most adaptation. So when you have someone's hand, say someone's trail wrist moving one way or someone's right shoulder moving one way, typically you'll also see most adjustments through the pelvis. So as if you had to start somewhere, so if you say, look, what's day one? If you want to really look at movement from someone goes, what is motion capture? What is biomechanics? Because they're very, very different things, by the way. It's something which always kind of makes me smile. There is no such thing as 3D biomechanics. Motion capture is a form of extracting information. Biomechanics is a principle that you apply to data. So where this words come from, who knows? Who knows? But that's a whole different discussion. They're very different disciplines. And so what a biomechanist would do would then use their knowledge of biomechanics and human movement and apply that to data. So I think if you have to kind of start somewhere, the pelvis is a good segment to start, because you don't see a ton of variability in most of the real good movers.
Is that basic? I mean, bearing in mind they're putting pressure into the ground, is the pelvic movement better because their lower body action's better?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of look at it many ways.
And does strength have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of yes, and just, you know, all those, you asked kind of three really good questions there, and then we can kind of go through those. So someone's how they control those segments, how they coordinate those segments, and how explosive they are move and how elastic they are moving will influence. Strength is a part of that kind of that understanding. So someone can be very strong, might be very, very slow in movement. So a good example might be, say, an endurance-based athlete, you know, a road cyclist perhaps, or a long-distance runner, wonderfully strong endurance-based athletes who are not particularly explosive in what they do. And for sure that, you know, how someone moves through foot and ankle in particular will have a huge influence on hip and pelvis, you know, huge influence as well. So the kind of then just going back to kind of finish that observation that the pelvis is, again, because it moves through the kind of least amount of range, and it also moves of all the main segments we have, it's also the slowest segment. You know, the rib cage moves faster, the hands and arms move quicker, and they go through bigger ranges. So to understand the pelvis is still a good place to start, because it moves, it's the slowest of the main contributing segments, and it's the one that goes to the least amount of range. That's why you see least amount of variability. Now, if you talk about hand and wrist stuff, well, I could probably show you 100 different case studies without even thinking about different wrist movements, different shoulder movements, different spine movements. That's a much more, I wouldn't say ambiguous approach, but a much more influenced by so many influences, their anatomy, their coaching history, their movement history, their perceptions, equipment, environment, all these kind of things. So pelvis is a good place to start.
Well, I always think pelvis is a key piece, not just for elite players and good players, but for club players as well, based off their posture and how they stand and things, and how the pelvis sits relative to their ability to move and rotate.
Massively right. I mean, you look at even kind of posture of the frames that we have, that one reason why we get so much low back pain, that typically most adaptations might migrate to the middle, the kind of proximal segment, which is the center of gravity is just a bit behind the belly button. We'll keep it kind of light and clean today. So just a bit behind the belly button, the center of gravity of the body. So most things migrate to the low back. So invariably you'll get low back pain, but the low back's not the issue. It could be a foot and ankle adaptation. Excuse me, could be a shoulder issue, could be a neck issue, could be a jaw issue, could even be how your teeth grow. Even looking at the TMJ, the joint in the jaw, teeth, skull formation, all these influences that we have that causes that kind of that response, that torsion through our system, that then all migrates to the middle. So you and I go is God, my back's sore and that's a bit stiff today. So typical approach is to say, resolving these issues would be, say, for example, to realign the pelvis, to kind of put it into a better position. For sure, you'll get that initial response that, oh, my back feels good, or I'm moving better now, but we've not really resolved why the pelvis had to adapt that way initially. So it's actually, to really resolve the issue, you've actually got to work away from the problem. So to get better at that, we've got to get better at this. So often you might go, my back's sore, well, I kind of get that, but it's how you move through your wrist is the issue. Because how the wrist is moving is then what makes you adapt and adjust through the pelvis in the way that you do.
It's interesting you say that, because I almost wonder sometimes whether players get a club into a certain position, or the weight of a club in a certain position, and they use the muscles and the pelvis to counterbalance that club. Absolutely to get it where they want it. You know what I mean? Bearing in mind that I know, although a golf club is actually light in a dead weight, right? Yeah. Obviously, once you're swinging it and it's got some speed to it, then it's obviously got more mass to it now. Yeah. Or it's harder to move. And I always think there is a combination between where the weight of the club goes and how the pelvis moves.
Yeah.
If they need to counterbalance that, and I think you see that more in the actual the way the pelvis moves than anything else. In
I
if
mean,
that club ends
sure.
up out of
Yeah.
position.
I mean, you can kind of look at it many ways. I mean, this again is what makes it such a fun approach to take. That is it the way the pelvis moved that then um, exposed the club to those forces and allowed the club to produce those forces, or vice versa? Is it the forces the club's producing and being exposed to made the pelvis adjust? It's a bit like saying in anatomy, but anatomy is a slightly clearer discussion. Is it the foot and ankle influencing the hip, or vice versa? How you look at that with the movement is if you improve the hip, does the foot respond? If you improve the ankle, does the hip respond? That's how you establish that stuff. But you're absolutely right. And it's a bit like actually I had a discussion with someone this morning around the idea of kind of kinetics and kinematics. Where do you start first? The club won't produce a force until it moves, but it won't move until the force is produced. Where do you start with this stuff? So I said, well, you look at kinetics and kinematics. For me, they're kind of actually quite low down the priority list when you look at movement. Many things have to happen way in advance of a force being produced. And it all starts with perception. How we perceive the movement will, in essence, then produce the movement in the forces that we kind of now measure. So perception, our understanding, our concept of the task, our perception of club delivery, our history of movement is then why we often produce the kinetic and kinematic values. And even if you look at perceptions, and the perceptions are controlled by our expectations. So everything still goes back to how we expect to move and how we perceive to move in golf. The basis of that is then why we get certain values and certain kinetic and kinematic values because of that stuff. So, I mean, it's a big discussion. I'm sure if you lined up 10 people, certainly kind of my contemporaries, you get 10 different answers.
Yeah, it's great.
What makes it fun? And I say that I love that. I say they're really embracing kind of. I take very few things personally. Then I like to go to bed each night confused and knowing I'm wrong. It's a cool play. I love these conflicts. It's a great place to be in life when you go, I need to look at this because I'm inaccurate. And I'm sure if you asked a very deterministic biomechanist, they will absolutely say, well, it's that. The reality is, but I can then go for every guy that does this. I'll show you 10 to do that.
Yeah. I think that ultimately is the problem. Yeah. It's very difficult to compare one golfer to another when physiologically they are so different. Whether that be height, strength, everything.
I did some recent stuff a while ago, and how would you help Bubba Watson?
Bubba, do you know what?
I mean, how would you?
Claude said he just walked around with him.
Yeah. I know his caddy. Well, his caddy is a guy called Ted Scott. So for those who do or don't know Ted, one of the best people I know in the US, just a wonderful guy. And I mean, so for Bubba, he moves wonderfully well for Bubba. So he kind of is a good example. It really uses the physiological and anatomical abilities that he has wonderfully well. And but aesthetically, or whether he may not conform to many of these kind of very deterministic views within biomechanics, but good luck trying to say Bubba's wrong. So,
but the thing is, when you look at, I think that's the thing though. You look at the aesthetics of something that don't quite look right, or not. They don't fit the norm.
Yeah.
Right. But when you strip away the outer shell that's Bubba, and you look at a 3D avatar on a screen, what does Bubba do that makes him a world-class athlete?
But he chose his parents well, so that kind of helps. So he kind of he chose his parents very well, Mike. So he kind of he picked a good mum and dad. So that kind of helped in many ways. And then the environment he was born into, and how he was allowed to evolve, and how his movement emerged through time. So a lot of it is down to even having no coaching is a form of coaching. If you think about it, receiving no explicit coaching is still a form of coaching because you watch and learn. That's still a form of coaching. So kind of how he kind of was coached. But I mean, he's just the most wonderful, explosive, again, I use those words elastic in terms of, we are elastic systems. That's how we are as humans. As a mover, hugely, you look at all the certainly within muscle physiology, the evidence around things like how muscles produce force and produce speed does that beautifully well. So then it really goes back to, well, who decides what the norm is? And who decides what good looks like?
The only thing that needs to look good is your scorecard.
Yeah, absolutely right. And You know, I've yet to meet Bubba, so I don't know what he does.
But
But
what I always find fascinating with, well, let's call these individual styles,
yeah,
is how many people over the years told him you'll never play like that and be
yeah.
successful.
And in a great way for him, he didn't listen, which is he's probably used it in a good way to kind of create those deep belief systems and those internal drivers that he has. Okay, I'll kind of show you wrong then. And so Bubba would have been a great case, maybe just being de-skilled through coaching. That's where kind of there's a dark side to data in a bad way that I think exposing Bubba to some information that was used very poorly, or certainly again if he was encouraged to move towards these kind of normative expected values, invariably these guys get de-skilled. So good for Bubba. So I guess there are many probably very sad cases of Bubba out there, that Bubba is maybe the one that did get away, and thankfully for him.
Okay, so if I just go back to pelvis for a minute, then
Yeah,
one of the things I've heard over the last couple of weeks doing these talks with various people is pelvic movement in longer hitters
yeah.
are moving more to the right,
Mm-hmm.
centre of the pelvis moving more to the right, and would I be right in saying almost completely unweighting their left foot?
Yeah, I guess you look at longer hitters or long drive players. So they're very different. A long drive golfers are very different to, say, tall players. It's a bit like saying comparing Usain Bolt and Mo Farah. Really. I mean, they both go around a track, but they're very, very different
Yeah,
athletes.
I think let's go tall players.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's kind of looking then more at the kind of some of the ground reaction forces and some of the pelvis positions. To give you a view on that, I mean, yes, yeah. I mean, that's not unrealistic in for sure. I mean, many guys still do it differently. And some of the very powerful guys that I've seen, still the pelvis goes a long way left still through transition, which would kind of sit more with convention perhaps of kind of recent times. But then equally, so a lot of guys do is a way of eccentrically applying the brakes essentially as they approach impact, because they kind of extend, they push so far hard through that left ankle, they elevate so much through that left hip, the response is the pelvis then backs up. So you can kind of look at it in a more accurate way, that rather than saying, hey guys, let the pelvis back up through impact, is appreciating why it has that response. And much of that just comes down to kind of two things: that how hard they break through their pelvis as they approach impact, and how much they kind of do really push and extend through that kind of left foot, left ankle, and left hip. Then the visual response is the pelvis can start to kind of back up through impact. So it's a bit like saying Rory, that it was quite popular in the kind of late 2000s that Rory's pelvis post impact starts to rotate clockwise again. But that's just a physiological response. His obliques pull so hard on his pelvis, because they pull so hard post impact, it kind of pulls the pelvis back a fraction. It's a bit like that. So for me, I would look at how do they move within their swing to produce that response. Well, they normally do two things where they break so hard, which is what allows that wonderful movement of energy through the spine, the rib cage, the shoulder, the hand, and so on. And they extend so well through that lead ankle and lead hip. Visually, what we then see is the pelvis, in essence, backing up. But what I would say to a player back up, whole different discussion. For me, that would be intellectual failure to take that approach. But
yeah. That's fair comment. And then we once we got this structure of the pelvis, that the modern measurement now seems to be the rib cage. Whereas we'd have always measured that, you read books and things, and they'll go, we rotate X amount thoracically or in each shoulder, which obviously, but we seem to be now measuring the rib cage more.
I don't know. I mean, I've only ever I actually look at both what the shoulder joints do is independent joints. So the shoulder rotation is kind of, is this, but colloquially it's been kind of called that in golf, which is a whole different discussion. So an actual shoulder rotation, as far as internal, external rotation, vertical, horizontal, ab and abduction, that kind of stuff, shoulder flexion. I measure those values through my system. So actually looking at what the shoulder does is different. But yes, I mean, you kind of look at it, the rib cage, for many reasons, is a much more revealing segment to look at, because most of the tissue connections that run through our system I need to know the answer. I shouldn't know the answer. I think it's about 90. Is it 90 muscles that attach into the rib cage? I should know the answer to that, but there's a lot. It's about 90 muscles attached into the rib cage. So you've got all these tissue connections that connect into the ankle, connect into the skull. So everything migrates through the rib cage. Even the thoracic spine, I mean, it can be tested that the spine isn't moving that much. But if the rib cage, say, is compressed on one side and rotated, which is very common in players, the spine then isn't allowed to move. So quite often, someone will say, oh, your thoracic spine is stiff, you lack range. Well, you don't. If you've got that measure those your ribs, Mike, and on the right side they're compressed and forwards.
Why would they be like that? Why would they be like that?
Habitual patterns, dominant movements, years of playing.
Would you see that in a player as well, Mark? Could you see that looking at him?
I mean, no one looks like really mum and dad made them, in my case, 44 years ago. So almost every player has those kind of those adaptations, which is in essence is still the main reason, one of the main reasons why we do what we do. So it's not unusual for someone to say, oh, you really lack thoracic range. Well, you don't. The thoracic spine is not allowed to move. Right? Discussion. So yeah, the rib cage for me is or the thorax, if you want to include the scapula and the shoulder region, is a much more revealing segment, both how it's the ranges it's moving through, how it controls, what control it has as it rotates, rather than say the shoulder, as it's informally been, probably discussed since kind of, books were first, logging this stuff 100 years ago. So,
and how are you finding the how players' rib cages are set? Is that profile of physio, or is that an X-ray?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, you can do it. Even do it very tangibly through looking at kind of various references. So if you know where to look, for example, say where the clavicle sits or the AC joint sits, or if you're kind of good at palpating through ribs and bottom rib, you can kind of through like any good consultant over time, through good palpation and touch, you can kind of predict where things are. Obviously, sure, an X-ray, even an MRI would give you obviously a more conclusive piece of feedback, but certainly that's not what's obviously available in a session. So that's kind of what I do with most players, that you kind of look through touch and look through observation. That I'll give you probably still the most three common adaptations you see for the rib cage, where most of us have an issue, and it's still the main reason why we do what we do, would be the rib cage is very inflamed. So the idea of the spine is extended. A lot of that stuff comes, sorry, Mike, from you get these guys, if I just rotate around, put close behind their back to kind of get good posture. I mean, just devastation for the spine. I mean, just truly awful. And we've all done it. So I'll be the first to 15 years back, I thought that was a good approach. A bit like they thought smoking was good in the 50s, really. And so we've all done that stuff. So I say that, I'm as much as part of the issue with that. But we now know 15 years on, that stuff's very, very bad. So a lot of when the rib cage is inflamed, to get rotation, the diaphragm needs to sit downwards. The diaphragm is still the most influential muscle on pelvic control. Sure, the glutes get much attention, but how the diaphragm creates that pressure down into the pelvis, going back to pelvis again, is so important. So the glutes, for sure, will control the hip locally, but where we get that pressure in that lumbar spine in pelvis comes through the diaphragm, breath, that kind of thing. Another one would be, if I try and reposition my camera as best I can, someone that's very kind of short through that right side, very compressed. So the idea being that the left side of the rib cage is like this, the right side's like that. That can really constrain rotation. Even organ placement, we have more organs on the right side of our bodies typically. So where our internal organs, it's called the visceral system, where our organs are, will change the way we breathe, change how breath is pushed through the rib cage in the lungs, will change rotation, organs move as we rotate. So all these things we need to consider.
But it seems to me, Mark, if you had a player who's in front of you at any level, and they got let's say a shortening of the right side in the way the rib cage is, basically, I don't know, just over time, that's how they naturally sit. Then you've got all the organs inside, and then you're trying to produce rotation. How much rotation would you actually take away?
Oh, huge
right?
amounts.
By, and this could just be a structural thing
Yeah.
of
You're actually
habit.
right. I mean, you look at that kind of two ways, Mike. I mean, these are habitual postures rather than um, um, natural postures. Natural is what mum and dad gave you on day one.
Mm.
Certainly, as you kind of move, the spine actually kind of gets its curves around at the age of 6. So actually, the spine doesn't really fully have its shape to the age of at the age of 6. I think the age of 6. So much of these are habitual movements we have over time. And you're absolutely right. It's still the basis of what we do. And I don't get frustrated, but I laugh about it. And I smile that we're so obsessed at the moment, or I'm not, but golf is around the club forces. And I get that. I get that. I get that. And because it is important. I say that. Like
Yeah, but the
I
problem is the club's
not,
forces come from the body.
well, you look at it, club. Those forces move in that direction because of what? They're being produced at that level because of what? So how can we start to, I think, look at, and I really acknowledge and appreciate the value of these things, and I do on a huge level. But I think if you've got a spine in that position, a rib cage in this position, how do you really resolve and improve something just by changing what the clubs do? It's only by restoring the spine, restoring the rib cage, given the anatomically wonderful movement again, can you then start to look, I think, at the wonderful information we now have around, say, club forces. Huge important, get it, completely appreciate it. But when you've got a shoulder like that and a neck like this, no, 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 no,
The
no,
other,
no.
the other thing is, if you go up the tree in golf,
Yep,
lifestyle changes at every ladder of the
yep,
right,
yep,
or every step of the ladder. So you get on at level one, you're literally playing at the club and going home. You go up a little bit higher, you're now playing elsewhere, and you go in and you spend the night in a hotel, and then you're driving home. Then
yep,
you go up again. Now you're traveling in an aeroplane, and then in a car, and
yep,
then getting to the golf club. So
yep,
everything goes against you being able to retain your posture
yep.
over a period of time. And you get to the
Mm-hmm.
highest level where they're not playing 30 events a year,
Yep.
where they're, aeroplane, car, on the golf club, right? The ability to keep your natural anatomical positioning and alignment
Mm-hmm.
must be of prior importance to
Always.
then being able to keep the swing going.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on every level, but yet, again, I said this in a fun way. Every year, golf has its new thing. This year is about X, and because it's fun and it sells and it's cool and it's a good discussion, and I get that. And I kind of say a lot, as people know, that the last thing we need in golf is more information. We don't understand well enough the information we currently have. Until we understand what we have currently to any real level, why do you want more information? But every year, it's almost like, what can this year's new thing be? And that's been golf for the last 10 years. Oh, we've got this new thing that's about this now. It's like, until we really understand to an element of mastery what the spine does, what the foot does, the information you've had for 50 years, why do you want to then put more noise and more pollution on top of that already very noisy system that we have? So it's always priority number one, this, our system, our frame, the posture, as you say. And unless that allows you to move well, I mean, I just simply, for me, it's intellectual. I don't know what it is. I wouldn't say failure, but looking at all the aesthetics and what do I know, Mike? What do I know? But I just don't see it that way.
Yeah,
And that's
but
why I had a discussion with a guy this morning. He goes, yeah, I did that stuff. I worked for kind of 3 weeks. And I was like, well, listen to what you're saying to me. 3 weeks. It's about being sustainable for life, not 3 days or 3 weeks. But and then he go to another philosophy and a different approach. And it's like, madness, madness.
and then we go from this if this and I find it quite fascinating this rib cage if this rib cage doesn't sit properly,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden how are you going to produce rotation if that
Absolutely.
doesn't?
Well, you move, and you can kind of look at it. And so you want to be really precise. The rib cage actually behaves a bit like 12 independent rib cages. We have these 12 kind of rings. First rib up here, then to kind of bottom rib, the kind of floaty rib. So we have kind of 12 sets of rings that form a rib cage. When you look at rotation, each ring, each rib at each level rotates independently and sequentially. So rotation starts when you look at the rib cage through the first rib, first ring, second rib, third rib, fourth. They all move with the spine. Just the thoracic spine is moving. The rib cage is also moving as well. So what you'll often find is they don't get rotation, they get movement. They kind of force themselves. They adapt their spine, they adjust their pelvis, they adapt their neck to produce This is why again, it doesn't. I went past frustration years ago with 3D data when you get Instagram, and I kind of say that in a cool way. Player X rotates 95 degrees, yeah, but he only really has about 20 degrees of true rotation. But all they do is they kind of go, and they force, and their average tour is 100 degrees, but it's not usable. It's just not valuable. So rotation, if you look at rotation in an accurate way, Mike, it's only really of any value until the initial point of adaptation. So you look at actually how the spine rotates. It's only really valuable rotation until they then start to adapt. So once the adaptation happens, it's no longer rotation; it's adaptive movement.
So, if I'm seeing this right, then, so we get the pelvic rotation, let's say 45 degrees, and then, or what you're saying is that rotation starts here and almost works downwards through the rib cage down towards
rotation starts in the skull.
Now, here's one there. So, and I really like to know the answer to this. What is the weight of a human head?
Well, here's a question for you. We've all got the same size skull. We've all got different size brains.
Give me the answer at some point.
I was going to. Sorry, my apologies. I was going to plug my phone in. My battery is losing charge very quickly. So there's your thought for the day. We've all got the same size skull, typically. We've all got different size brains. There's your thought for the day. Typically about 5 kilos, the head weighs. So the adult human skull for the male is about 5 kilos. About 10 to 12 pounds.
Is that full, as it is on a human body?
But it's what it's full of, isn't it? It's a different discussion. But yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So the human head is a head, teeth, hair, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the lot.
About 5 kilos. Yeah, about 12 pounds, 10 to 12 pounds.
And how much influence does that have on your ability to rotate?
So for every inch forward the head sits in that position, there's about an additional 30 pounds of pressure through each vertebrae in your neck. Okay. So your cervical spine, the vertebrae into this part of the neck, have to absorb and support an additional 30 pounds for every inch forward it sits. So huge. So guys that perhaps know me in senior work, a lot of stuff I do around head and neck awareness, because rotation starts at the atlas, the top of the spine, up into the skull. So if that's in an adaptive position already, rotation is an adaptation. It's an adjustment. You might get these guys go, well, the top tour player does 100 degrees. It's irrelevant, because you look at how they produce that value is far more important than the value itself.
Yeah, just something that in my head is that I just think if I was trying to keep my head in a fixed position and move, it's not just the fact that it's fixed here, so I've got to be limited to some degree in rotation, but it's what is actually fixing it there. What are the because obviously muscles, but you're going to hold it there while I'm turning.
Yeah, I mean, things like, for example, obviously eye perception, how you want to see the ball. So obviously eye position and eye orientation will hugely influence that. The fact that the tissues are so fixed and they're kind of held in that position, the joints have adjusted so they're not allowed to move as well. So the facet joints of the spine are in a different position. So all these things influence gravity. Will obviously have a huge influence on the head as well. So really how you sit through head and neck, vital. I mean, beyond vital as far as where rotation comes from.
And you said a minute ago, you said that it was so many pounds per.
So every inch forward. So the idea of what we call forward head posture. So every time the head goes forwards, which is, there'd be a lot of that now because there's so many people unfortunately spending time sitting down because of the current situation. So every inch forward the head sits in. It's called cervical protraction, or forward head posture is the more kind of informal definition. It's an additional 30 pounds of pressure you put through each vertebrae in the neck.
Okay, I get it.
That's you then get huge. Yeah, you then get 3 or 4 inches of forward head, which is not unusual in most of us. That's a lot of pressure that part of the spine has to absorb. So that will intrinsically massively change how the spine produces rotation. So you can talk about lead wrist flexion and adduction and bore yourself around that stuff. Is irrelevant.
So the frame almost now of the modern player is actually a lot more relaxed, isn't it? As opposed to,
I think they look more relaxed because they're not as adapted. It goes back to perhaps Adam Scott, bless him. I mean, wonderful spine for him, but probably helped very few people because they aspired to look like Adam Scott through no fault in any way. Adam Scott is just a wonderfully good, good athlete, good mover. The idea of this straight spines and the spine is a huge S shape. It always kind of makes me smile why it's then called S posture by some people, because the spine is an S shape. That's a different discussion. The spine is S shape because of the curves we have in the cervical, lumbar, and thoracic spines. So I think players are now more aware of spine health and spine shape and segment alignment, that they're a little less rigid in body work. Again, you mentioned when I started 20 years back in, Keith Williams in that generation, not obviously Keith did this, but that kind of generation, that were straight spines and clubs behind us in straight backs. I mean, the back is the spine is a huge S shape. So why would you want to, you start losing those curves in the spine, and again, you hugely influence how we rotate once more. So again, why it's called S shape or S posture, then who knows, because it is an S shape.
And I mean, we keep going around in this circle, but if we go around in the circle back to Jack Nicklaus, Hogan, Sneed, they probably have better posture than maybe players had in the 90s.
Oh, I mean, don't start on that stuff. I mean, some of the challenges, I mean this in a very fun way. So for your listeners, please feed us in a fun way. You don't need to be good anymore at golf. That's the problem. We've never had to be so bad at golf and be good. The equipment is so easy now. You don't need to be good anymore. I mean, so the guys in the 90s, and you and I are probably of a similar generation. I started with wood, and that's how I started playing in the 80s. That generation had to be good at moving to make the club work. You had to be a great mover. Some of my favourite movers over time, Trevino, Bobby Jones, Harry Varden, Greg Norman, these guys, they had to be the most, outstanding movers to be good at golf, because the equipment was so bad. I mean, and I say this with great humour, you just have to hold it these days and it kind of does it for you. So the idea of being good at golf anymore is, you don't need to be good anymore. And I'm really upset because I kind of missed that generation. Right? So that's my own frustration coming out in a fun way. And I try and play golf. I'm a member of a club in England, and I love playing as often as I can. And but absolutely right. So the days of the Trevinos and the Nicklases and the Palmers. I mean, how good were they at moving these guys? How good? It was ridiculous.
And I don't think we've ever thought of that. I've never contemplated the fact that because they could hit the ball with what they were hitting, they moved better than some modern players. But what's really interesting is, why are we then trying to go back to swing like them? Because they move better.
Well, that's my question on many times. I mean, it's a different discussion now because equipment's so different, the club's different, the ball's different. So our movements have evolved or even devolved. If you look at it accurately, we've actually devolved in movement because of equipment now. It's a bit like saying why kids' handwriting is so poor these days. We don't write anymore because we use laptops all the time or phones. We don't need to write anymore because soon my daughter is approaching 2 years of age. She probably won't know what a pen is in 20 years' time because that'll be just our generation. So I think you can learn a lot from history. You can extract so, and I say that to most people, that success leaves clues in life. It's one of my kind of big approaches that I use, and in many ways. And but it's different now. It's just different. Grasses are different, balls are different, clubs are different, expectations are different. Our understanding is different. Is it really fair to compare? You can get a lot of good stuff from it, but I don't see the value in comparing stuff now. Accept it for what it is and embrace it for what it is, rather than looking back at our generation. I started playing in '89, and Fowler was my great hero, and I learned by watching the videos, like most of us back in the late '80s at the Ledbetter. But great, I was obsessed by it. And these days, it's just different. It's just different. Yeah. Just embrace it for what it is.
If we go through the final piece of this jigsaw, I'm working my way up through the body over a period of time.
Yeah.
Is that we're sitting here, we're a lot more relaxed, we've got a head. Then our shoulders have obviously changed massively as well, and the scapular positioning now against when we had the big wide chest and the S-shaped posture of Adam Scott.
Yep.
So it's almost, would we be right saying now that actually the shoulders now are quite a lot different, so we're going to work differently?
Yeah, I mean, even the frames of players are different. I mean, I just seen a question online from Paul Whalen up, and I actually know Paul well, so thanks for that, Paul. He's asked around why did Nicholas had spine injections. I don't, there could be an underlying orthopedic issue with someone like Jack Nicklaus, that why he had so many injections and hip replacements. That could be an orthopedic influence. He had injections. It could be many things. I mean, bone degeneration, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis. Did he actually move well? I use Nicholas as a kind of like all these guys. I mean, did they really move great? Still, my favourite mover in golf is Trevino. I love Trevino. I think he's a fantastic mover. Nicholas, moved great for Nicholas. Would he move that way now? Knowing what we now know, who knows? But I think that there probably would have been some underlying orthopedic issues with someone like Jack Nicklaus as to why he had spine pain. But yeah,
I think the other aspect there, Mark, is not necessarily the movement as well. It was how they got the ball airborne.
Yeah. So that's what I mean.
The old ball, you had to launch it as high as you could. Yeah. Now the ball just goes up in the air.
Yeah, exactly right. So do we need to move that way anymore? When the equipment does it for us. I mean, so the frames of players are different. I mean, these guys were such better athletes 50 years ago, such better athletes 50 years back. They might train differently now, but I mean, if you look at, there's more bone disease now, there's more tissue disease now, despite the wonderful advancements in medicine. So they were just good movers back then through life. They had to be. Someone's asked a question about Tommy Fleetwood, and so Fleetwood often gets referenced as having something called Sherman syndrome. So Sherman's is a spinal adaptation. I don't think, to my understanding, it's Sherman's what he has, but that is through birth. I mean, he was born that way with the shape of spine that he has. So Sherman's condition, Mike, is a form of kyphosis, a rounding in the spine. David Howell had it. I think Frank Lampard had it. It's not unusual to get Sherman's. It's called Sherman's disease. I don't like that word. It should be more of a condition. So it's kind of this kind of rounded posture. Usain Bolt was born with scoliosis, and he still ran pretty good. So most of these guys, to answer the question I just saw pop on my screen there, they learn to move around the frames that they have. So I think with someone like Tommy Fleetwood, if you tried to influence his spine, you'd probably destroy him. His neurological code was based around having a spine that shape. That's a common question you see. But to my understanding with Tommy Fleetwood, I've never actually met. It's just the way. It's just through life. That's a structural adaptation, not an adaptive adaptation. Some guys adapt into these positions. Some guys are born with them. David Howell had Sherman's. I think Frank Lampard did. Bolt had scoliosis. Those guys still did pretty good because their neurological system was coded around the frames that they have. That's how they learned to play.
And I presume that you'd have to be very careful with them, because if you tried to create them into the norm, they could well get injured.
Well, it goes back to the start of the discussion, Mike. Knowing what to leave is far more important than knowing what to improve. So again, this is where kind of 3D data is used so poorly. Actually just knowing what to accept and leave alone is far more important than actually knowing what to adjust. So for me, that's the priority number one. What do we just leave? Because they've done that for 10 years. It's the shape of their spine. Their whole system is being coded to move around a foot in that position, a neck in that position. So it really goes back to, again, when we have these normative values, for me, that's a very irresponsible way of seeing things. I mean, you've got to look at them always as case studies of one. Everyone's a case study of one, which is why I kind of go back to when you look at some players move this way, but 10 players do it that way. That's it's not helping golf, and it's not helping anyone when you start comparing anyone with anyone.
It's interesting because last week, I think it was last week, I spoke to Dave Alred, who was originally Johnny Wilkinson's kicking coach. You know David, and David, the first thing he said was, we never compare to anybody else in terms of our performance. So he said, you can do whatever you want, I don't care, but we will use your benchmarks and your results to compare back to. We'll never compare against anybody else. And you almost said the same thing from a
my question to the audience, why is golf taking this approach, comparing people, and this is what players do, and it's like when I do any Instagram post, I share, this is what I see, this is my observation, there's 1,000 different ways of doing it. It's things I'm always just trying to give a balanced view around it. This is just a way, not the way. It's a way of doing something. And I could equally, I could do a post the following day and be completely the opposite, because it's just how someone else does it differently. So I think whenever it's called deterministic thinking, this is the way it should be done. That's how people do it. It's just simply not true. Because again, for everyone that does it you'll find someone does it so different elsewhere.
Somebody's put here, do you think there is anything the equipment industry can do to prevent injury in the average golfer?
What can equipment do? For sure, obviously, shaft design and grip design can maybe absorb some of the forces in the club. Not really. I mean, even looking at shoes, Mike, you can kind of, you can wear different footwear, but I think if the foot, for me, it's about the foot moving well, not the shoe. So I kind of say to most guys, the better the shoe, the worse the foot.
I don't think shoes have ever got to the standard of athletics or football.
No, but even then, I think, the more advanced the shoe, the often the least advanced the foot, because then the shoe's doing it rather than the foot. Yeah. The foot gets more redundant. That might be one for me to share. That needs a bit of thought, and it's a nice question. Anyone that knows me well will only ever really give feedback if I'm fairly kind of fairly comfortable around. If I don't know, I don't know, and on that one I don't know. I think it's still down to you and I. Unfortunately, it's one of the few things we still we're not that automated as people yet, that we don't have to think yet. But it's still just down. It's just moved well. It's just us moving good.
And I think, when we wrap this up and do, and I mean, at the end of the day, everybody's an individual with their own body, with their own mobility, flexibility, strength, coordination, whatever. We could come up with a million different things that are that person's DNA. The reality is, that the better we understand them, the better they get.
Yeah, absolutely right.
You know what I mean?
But I've gone so far away from looking at, like you kind of said there, around comparing people, looking at what other people do, and so far out with the last 10 years, it's about when the player comes in with the constraints placed upon them, with their movement background, their coaching background, their perceptions of movement, their belief systems, their values, all these things. That's why we move in that way. Their personality. That's how human movement evolves, rather than saying, well, people are trying to use other players to reinforce their own values and their own ego. Then, this is what people do. Well, fine, great, but how's that helping everyone else? This doesn't do anything for me. Then
the other thing I think, Mark, is when we look at players, and if we're let's say profiling players or taking results three-dimensionally, force plays, whatever I play. Really, what we're trying to do is understand that player and make him better.
Absolutely right. Priority number one, like, don't make him worse, because whatever you say or don't say will have an influence in either. If you say nothing to a player, that will have an influence on them. They'll think, okay, maybe I'm doing a good job, or wow, why have you not picked up on this? So it doesn't matter what you say or don't say, it will always influence the player in one way. So no one ever leaves a session ever exactly in the same position. Saying nothing, like I said, then they'll think, wow, okay, so I'm good then, when you're clearly not. Or why has he not said this stuff? And that will reinforce even more then kind of conflict inside of them. So massively that. It's just about individual.
If we take like the average golfer who might have poor posture, might not be able to move as well, who might have, then actually we're better off using what they've got and making them better with it than trying to change them. Because if you try and change them, we could open a can of worms.
I mean, absolutely
from an injury perspective and a performance.
It's always the first thing. Okay, look at what they do. Look at what they have rather than what they don't have. How do we use what someone has? I mean, that's golf coaches frequently. I mean, bless them, that they're more concerned about who they're not working with rather than who they are working with. And I've always, the most important guys I'm lucky to be with are the ones that I currently am very fortunate to be around. I never look at, I wish I could work with him. I don't see it that way. I'm very grateful for the ones I do have time to spend time with. And it's just where we're at, I guess. And it's the world of instant validation and gratification and ego and fear and all that stuff. And I just have no time for that, Mike. Anytime anyone approaches me with a question, you can tell it's influenced by ego. It's like, I'm glad they made the delete button. One of my
You know
favourite.
what? You know the other thing is, Mark, in a world of things like Instagram, Facebook, whatever, it is all about what it looks like.
Everyone wants to be told they're right. I'm right,
You know
you're
what I
wrong.
mean? So we live in that world, but I think the important message is everybody's different, and everyone should be compared to themselves
Yeah, be the
from
best.
all perspectives,
That's my
not
approach.
compared to anybody else.
Yeah, just be the best at being you, and understand. Okay, how do we really evolve that? So that's a very important thing.
Brilliant, Mark. It's been ace.
My
I
absolute
really
pleasure.
enjoyed talking to you. I now know how much your head weighs. That's it. The number of
That,
people I have said, do you know what? If you put it there, just think how much it weighs and go,
5 kilos.
why don't you go see how much it weighs?
But
Now I know.
that's your question. That if everyone's skull is the same size, why are our brains different sizes?
Do you know what? I'll have to see who I can get on one of my talks next who can tell me.
Thanks for that.
Mark, it's been brilliant. Thanks for
My
your time.
pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thanks, mate.
Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks again.